We're gathered here today on Amiskwaciwâskahikan, traditional Treaty 6 territory of First Nations and Métis Nation of Alberta, Zone 4. We respectfully acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this land for centuries, including the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota, Blackfoot, as well as the Métis and Inuit. This land is and has been a welcoming place for all people who come and call it home. Come to Edmonton and call it home. It is a place built for community, trade, friendship, and shared understanding. We recognize those Indigenous peoples who are still fighting for equality today, and we support them in the spirit of decolonization and reconciliation. We remain committed to honoring the struggle of our Indigenous siblings and joining with them to end injustice. Together, we call upon all of our collective honored traditions and ancestors to help us work together in the spirit of community and understanding today and onwards. So why do we do treaty acknowledgements? We are all treaty people. Long ago, when the first settlers came to this land, the Indigenous peoples signed treaties in goodwill and in good faith. The treaties were meant to honor the traditional land and way of life of the Indigenous peoples, ensure their rights and prosperity, and to build understanding and mutual cooperation. Today, we acknowledge the treaty land as a way to recommit to honoring the spirit of those treaties and to recognize the continued rights of Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of this land. We recognize that many Indigenous peoples have been dispossessed of their land and traditional ways of life and the prosperity that came along with them. We acknowledged the treaty to understand we each have a role to play as treaty people in reconciliation and in righting historical wrongs that have taken place. If you're joining us from outside of Treaty 6, we would invite you to share your land acknowledgement based on your treaty area. So, a little about who we are. Since its establishment in 1993, the Centre for Race and Culture, CFRAC, formerly known as the Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism and to encourage intercultural understanding. We take an intersectional approach, and our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. If you would like to learn more about our current events, projects, or activities, please visit our website, cfrac.com, and sign up for our newsletter. We have an upcoming session on June 22nd, 2022 from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. and we hope to see you there. So now we will launch some polls on your screen that collect anonymous demographic data. You don't have to answer, but it does help us to understand our audience better if you do. And it helps us with future seasons. So we're hoping for a season 3. So this will just take about a minute. So if I had Jeopardy music, I would play it. So it's just 6 questions, shouldn't take too long. Thank you, I see you answering. The numbers are advancing on the screen, that makes me happy. All right, so we'll give you 25 more seconds or so. Wonderful, thank you. We appreciate it. Yeah, we also have a do not wish to answer button, so you can use those if you want as well. All right. 10 more seconds, and then I'll introduce our speakers. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. That helps us so much when we're planning our future seasons to understand the demographics of our attendees. So I will tell you a little bit about our speakers. First, I'd like to introduce you to Caitlin Dick. Caitlin Dick is an associate lawyer with the Deborah Hatch Law Office and is of mixed Ukrainian and Métis ancestry. Her practice centers around criminal defense, appeals, and related litigation, including police and prison issues. While in law school, she held positions of leadership in the LGBTQ+ Law Student Society, the Equity and Diversity Committee, and volunteered her time completing legal research for a local sex worker support agency. She is currently secretary of the Criminal Trial Lawyers Association, CTLA, Policing Committee, a director with the Alberta Prison Justice Society, and a regional advocate with the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. Prior to becoming a lawyer, she worked as a social worker / support worker in a variety of environments. Her approach to her legal practice is informed by this experience, as well as an anti-oppressive, trauma-informed, and intersectional lens, as much as possible, while working within the Canadian criminal justice system. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Helen Rusich. Helen has a background in human resource management, community development, adult education, and organizational behavior. As a project manager with Reach Edmonton for 11 years, she oversees the Police and Youth Engagement Program, PYEP, a youth-led, community-driven, award-winning initiative. The goals of PYEP are to strengthen and build relationships with the Edmonton Police Service and ethnocultural communities, to build youth leadership skills, to raise awareness and educate youth and their families about diverse populations such as the LGBTQ+ community, neurodiversity, and Indigenous communities, as well as to provide employment and volunteer opportunities for youth. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for this evening, Robert P. Lee. Robert P. Lee was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta. He was on the Dean's Honor List in the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Law. Robert articled at the national law firm of Blake, Castles, and Graydon in Calgary before returning to Edmonton to practice law. Robert was admitted to the Law Society in 1990 and has extensive litigation experience in criminal law and civil litigation. He has also been hired by the provincial government to prosecute criminal charges. Robert received a judicial appointment to the provincial court, sitting as a justice of the peace on a part-time basis from 1997 through 2010. Robert's present practice focuses on helping victims achieve justice through the legal system. Robert has assisted many sexual abuse victims to sue and obtain substantial amounts of compensation through lawsuits, settlements, and crimes compensation applications. Robert has appeared as a guest speaker on 3 occasions for the Canadian Institute at their annual conference in Toronto, Ontario, for institutional liability for sexual abuse. Robert is also committed to volunteerism and sat on the board of directors of the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton for 4 years. This is our panel for this evening. I thank you for your attention. Please use the Q&A button to ask the panel questions throughout. They'll get to them at the end and they may pepper them throughout. And I will hand the event off to Mr. Lee and our wonderful speakers.
Thank you very much, Serafina. It's my pleasure to be part of this group and speaking about these topics. They're so important and really important for us to have some greater equality. The first point that I just want to make is that we are making great progress on these issues. And the best representation of that, in my view, is that recently the Law Society of Alberta has acknowledged that there has been systemic discrimination in and is systemic discrimination in our legal system. So for the professional body that governs lawyers to make that kind of admission or concession or acknowledgement, I think is an amazing step and shows great progress. And it's a result of the work that people like Helen and Caitlin have been doing for many years, and that so many other not-for-profits. So I think that's the first point I'd like to make, is how important that has been. Do we want to go right into the questions? Serafina?
Absolutely, that would be great. We've just
okay. So the first question for our speakers is, how can racialization be defined? Why it is important, and why is it important to talk about it? Caitlin?
Sure, I'll jump in. I'm used to waiting for everyone else to go first because I'm more junior, and in the courtroom, that means you have to wait for all the other senior lawyers to go first. So I quite like this question, because the word racialization I like because it accurately conveys that it's an active process that is imposed on others. So to be racialized is to be othered on the basis of a designation as being not white. So that's the definition that I understand it to be. And so it's an activity that people do to other people. It's a designation, and it's something that's conferred upon somebody. It's nothing that's inherent to anybody's identity or culture. It's the category that society has placed them within. And it's important too that this is reflected in the fact that racialized folks aren't a monolith, but what they do have in common is that non-whiteness. So when we live in a society where whiteness is normative, whiteness is the norm, anything other than that is racialized. So it's important to talk about this because when we are othering somebody on the basis of being non-normative, we are marginalizing them. And so we are making their experiences something that is not relatable to everybody, even though it is possibly relatable to the majority of the population. And we are reducing their opportunities. We are reducing the way that we look at them. We are reducing their autonomy. So that's why it's important to talk about in a nutshell.
Helen, what would you like to add?
So I actually looked this up, and like Caitlin said, racialization is the act of giving a racial character to someone or something, the process of categorizing, marginalizing, or regarding according to race. And so this is very important to talk about because the majority of BIPOC people experience racism, microaggressions every day, and it leads to racial trauma, internal racism, and the costs for our society on a social, psychosocial aspect, economically, psychologically, all have its impact. And so it not only impacts those folks who are discriminated against, it impacts all of us. And I think we're worse off as a society because of what we do to each other.
So I just mentioned that the Law Society has acknowledged that there's systemic discrimination in the legal system. Why do you think that's important that they've acknowledged that and have brought it to the attention of lawyers and the public? Caitlin?
Well, I would say you can't begin to address a problem that you don't acknowledge exists. So, of course, acknowledgement is the first step in taking steps to get at the root of where those problems come from. I mean, acknowledgement is great. It is definitely a first step, though, is what I would say. And the limits of that acknowledgement, I think, is something that needs to go further. We need to, when we acknowledge that something is systemic, we also need to understand that, okay, what are the factors within society that perpetuate the nature of this, right? So when you speak about racism to the average person, they think about individual racistly held attitudes. When we talk about systemic racism, what we are acknowledging is that the actual structures of society have been built in such a way to uphold things as normative, like whiteness. So that's really important that the Law Society is taking that step to say, we are recognizing that this isn't an individual bias. This is something that is deeply rooted within the system. It's the water that we swim in. And so to take steps to dismantle that system or dismantle the bias and the racism, you do need that first step of saying, this is what the problem is.
And Helen, in your experience, do you think that this is something that is occurring more? Are we talking more about it now than we have in the past?
You mean racism in general?
Yeah.
I'd like to think so. Maybe it's because I'm so immersed in it. I certainly see lots of, activity from various service providers. It's certainly coming up in the community very often. People aren't as afraid to talk about it. And I think the other thing to add to what Caitlin said is that, if you're not a lawyer, you're not in the criminal justice system, most people don't have much understanding. And there's so much power within the criminal justice system from law enforcement, from judges, lawyers themselves, who are seen as people that have a law degree and have, a higher level of education and expertise. But, if you're a refugee or an immigrant or, Indigenous person, there can be bias just in terms of their stereotype around who those populations are. And people tend to see them as one group, which they're absolutely not.
And so for myself personally, I kind of see this acknowledgement in two ways. And so when we talk about an issue, and on one hand, when we talk about it and we acknowledge it, I think that's a positive for us to move forward. But then on the flip side, when we acknowledge it, in a way, it's kind of upsetting for me as a lawyer to hear that our law society acknowledges that there is systemic discrimination and has been. What are your views on how the discussion of these issues and the realization for people that there is discrimination, how do you think that people can deal with that when we are talking about it and understanding that it does exist?
So that's a big question. And I think that the answer would differ according to where you sit within our society. So I'm going to deal with that a lot differently than you would, or anybody else, depending on how a person has been marginalized or racialized, right? And that's where actually one thing that I noted, for instance, in law school was that, and I went to law school very recently, very recently. We are starting to have these conversations where you can take entire classes on things like the TRC calls to action. We are talking about racialization in criminal law classes in your first year of law school. But there's a big difference between having these academic discussions where you are talking about them as abstract concepts, as abstract ideas that exist in intellectual discourse. And what are we actually going to do about this in terms of people's lived experiences? How are you going to incorporate this into your practice as a lawyer? How are law schools going to incorporate this into their admissions policies, into who gets scholarships, into who completes law schools, into what accommodations people get in exams? Like, it is truly present at every step of the journey, from law school admission right through to passing the bar and practicing as a lawyer. And that's just to speak about the lawyer's experience. In the criminal justice system, and there are other questions that I know you have for us that talk about how we see the presence of racialization and the effect in the justice system, but that's a whole different conversation too. So how do we deal with this? I would say, if I had to put an answer on that question, I would say we have to think about what action we're going to take and how we're going to do more than just have discussions. Discussions are great. This discussion's great. This is something that I'm hoping everybody's going to take away and think about what they can do in the community, but we do need to be doing more than that.
That's, Caitlin, for me, I went to law school more than 30 years ago, and there were no classes like that when I was in law school. So I think that shows a very positive step in the law schools. Helen, do you have any comments? The three of us come from different racial backgrounds. Do you have any comments with regard to, when we talk about these issues, how people from different backgrounds might approach it?
For sure. So I think my biggest learning in this area is to be reminded of who I am in my place and power of privilege. And so if I can remind myself in every space that I go to, which is work, but it's necessary work. And I remember a young Indigenous Black queer woman had said to me, as we were sort of sharing who and what we are, is I was just telling her about family and, how hard it was growing up in poverty and mental health, yada, yada, yada. And she basically said, that's too bad, but I'm Black and Indigenous, and I don't feel very safe in the world. And I went, she's right. Oh my God. It's not to discount my experience, but I feel I have to use my power and privilege to leverage and to remind myself to elevate the voices and keep my place, because I am, just by the nature of the color of my skin and my age and education, in a different place. And so that's what I've learned.
I think just our own conversation that we're having right now shows the importance of this topic about why it's so important to talk about these things, because there's so much learning that we can have. So the next question I'd like to ask is, how can the criminal justice system be defined, and why is that important? Caitlin, do you want to take that one on?
Sure. So, I would define the criminal justice system as the way we prosecute and punish crime in Canada. And so I'm being very specific about using the word crime, because quite often the public perception is that it's how we hold harm doers accountable. But crime and harm are not always the same thing. Crime is legally prohibited behavior. It can be harm, it can be behavior that is harmful to others, but it can also address behaviors where harm is either not or is negligibly present. So that's a big thing, I think, that if anyone can take anything away from this, I really want people to sit and think about, when you think about the word criminal and the word crime, are you automatically assuming somebody who has harmed others? Because quite frankly, that's not always the case, especially for folks. A really good example is, say, theft from a large corporation, like really low-level shoplifting stuff. Or theft where at the end of the day, somebody's belongings were returned to them unharmed. We see that quite a bit in our practices. So, of course, it is a system by which we have over hundreds of years developed to address where somebody breaks the law in our country. We have these laws for a reason: to keep people safe, to keep property safe, to ensure order in our society. But that is how I would define it, is it's the way that we prosecute and punish crime. And so I think that conversation about what crime is and should be an ongoing one. So I would define the system just further as beginning with police interaction. So beginning with the moment that a police officer stops or talks to somebody, investigates them, and ends with the end of a process. So somebody gets charged, then they get to decide what to do with that charge. Are they going to plead guilty and get a sentence? Are they going to take it to trial and get acquitted, or get found guilty, and then we're back to sentencing? So it begins with police interaction and it ends with either an acquittal, you're found not guilty, or you get sentenced.
Helen, your thoughts?
So I looked this up. Criminal justice system of law enforcement that is directly involved in apprehending, prosecuting, defending, sentencing, and punishing those who are suspected or convicted of criminal offenses. And so to me, that means it involves law enforcement, our court system, and prisons. And then alternatives to prison. And so, when I look at that definition, I sort of say, look what happened to our Indigenous people and the graves. That was great harm. How do we prosecute that? I know it's kind of a ridiculous example, but that's just, some of my thinking around this.
And that's exactly the point, is that crime is elastic. I mean, up until mid last century, lots of activity relating to homosexuality was illegal in Canada. Like buggery laws weren't repealed until quite late in that century. Prostitution is a good example of the way that our society is stretching and evolving to consider what things are crime and what things aren't crime. You see that in terms of drug laws, for instance. I think that is evolving. Simple possession, is that something that should be a crime? Is that something that somebody deserves potential punishment for? I think that's evolving. So crime is not something that is static. It's not written in stone. And our criminal justice system, what it does is it addresses crime first and foremost. So it's something that is a system that is constantly evolving.
So on that point, Helen gave a very precise definition of the criminal justice system. And you're talking now about how the definition of a crime is malleable and elastic and changes. Really, do you think that in our view of what is a crime and what the criminal justice system is, do you think it can go beyond just the police part, the crime, the punishment, that part? Because what about poverty and the fact that many crimes are committed due to poverty or other issues? Is the fact that we don't provide the necessary social supports, could that be considered part of our criminal justice system as well? Any thoughts on that?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think so when we're talking about the criminal justice system, I do understand that to be a very narrow system. But of course, it does interact with other things like poverty, for instance, the things that feed people into the criminal justice system. When we talk about policing, we are talking about more than just policing crime. Robin Maynard in Policing Black Lives, she talks about the child welfare system as being equally as punitive in some cases as the criminal justice system. Now, do people in the child welfare system face the same kind of sanctions and penalties? Arguably no, but arguably yes. The loss of a child, for instance, one could argue, is just as devastating to a person as being put in jail and losing your child that way. So that's a really good question that you're bringing up, Robert. Is the criminal justice system like a narrow set of how we address it through the courts, or is it like a big societal organism, like a jellyfish that is more than some of its parts?
And so for both of you, the next part of the question is, why is it important the way we define the criminal justice system? Like if we use a more expansive definition, do we take more factors into consideration than if we just take the narrow definition?
Yes, I would say yes. If we're going to expand the definition of what is, well, I mean, it depends, right? Are we talking about expanding what is crime? Because if we're talking about expanding what is crime, then we're going to catch more behaviors where people can be punished for more things, which I would never ever say is a good thing. Or we can talk about the system in general, because if we're talking about a system in general that goes beyond just being criminally charged with something, then perhaps efforts that we take to mitigate the harm of the criminal justice system, or to mitigate over-incarceration of racialized people, to mitigate overcharging of them, can also address these factors. So if we are talking about social housing, for instance, as being a determinator of crime, if we're including that in our definition of the criminal justice system, maybe we can get some Justice Ministry budget for social housing. So perhaps that would be a helpful thing.
Any thoughts, Helen?
Yeah, see, I don't feel I know enough about the criminal justice system. However, I know enough, or I'd like to believe that when there is, sentencing, that there are other factors brought in terms of, are you Indigenous? That the Gladue report or those kinds of things come into play. That there is restorative justice as a potential. Because when you look at the costs of putting people in prison, they're huge. Mm-hmm. And there's evidence to show that in other countries there's way less prison time, and I don't believe it's very effective, and yet the cost is so high. And so what are the alternatives? Because if you look at the majority of people in prison, according to the stats that I've seen, it should really be maybe 10 or 15%. The rest have trauma and brain injury and have been racialized and in poverty. And so, I just, that doesn't make sense to me. And that's why I look at things more from a preventative point of view, as if, we can provide supports to families and marginalized, racialized communities at the start, then we will save so much, not just economically, but, for people's health and wellness.
Yeah, and I think that that's an important point, because when we talk about, some of the movements about, defunding or, providing less funding to the police as part of the criminal justice system, I think we can avoid crime, or possibly we can avoid crime, by providing more supports. And so if we look at it in a more expansive way, I think that we can avoid people going into the quote unquote criminal justice system and diverting them if perhaps our budgeting for criminal justice went into other ways, such as more social programs. So that might be a reason why it could be more important to look at criminal justice in a wider context rather than a narrow context. So the next question is, in your practices, in your work, how are you seeing the impacts of racialization in your work? Caitlin?
Well, you can walk into any courtroom, any criminal courtroom in the courthouse on any given day and count the amount of white appearing faces and see for yourself. It's a well-known fact that people who are racialized are charged more by the police. They interact with the police more. And I want to describe also kind of a vicious cycle that I see in my work. So when people are arrested, they can be and charged with a crime. They can be released by the police on conditions that they have to follow. And this is sort of like, we call it a promise to appear or a recognizance or an undertaking. Basically says, okay, until you've dealt with these charges, follow these conditions, and you can be released. You can be out in the community. In some cases, in lots of cases, the police will not do that, and they will hold people for a bail hearing, where then they get to go before a justice of the peace, or later on in a courtroom before a judge, and they have to argue to the court why they should be released. And what I often see is people being denied bail. And when I say people, I specifically do mean racialized people, racialized clients, who are being denied bail because they've got prior convictions of not being able to comply with release conditions. Maybe they've got an addiction and somebody told them, okay, you have to abstain totally in order to get bail and stay in the community, which they've been set up to fail, or you have to live in a particular house when your housing is unstable, or there are a wide range of reasons that people could, or for instance, you live on reserve and you have to come to court and you couldn't find a ride that day. So when they've got a record full of these breaches, that makes it less likely that they're going to be released on bail. And so when somebody is denied bail, what that means is that they stay in the remand center until their charges have been dealt with. So until either they've pled guilty and been handed a sentence, or they've gone to trial and been acquitted or found guilty. That makes it way more attractive for somebody. If you are looking at the difference between pleading guilty now, getting more credit for the time you spent in remand, and potentially being able to get out because you're sentenced to 30 days for pleading guilty earlier, or waiting 8 months to get to trial, I know what I would pick if it's between sitting in remand, which the courts have recognized is a way worse place to be than a serving prison. That's why for every day you spend in remand, generally you get a day and a half of credit towards your sentence, because it's not a place for people to stay long term. And so what happens then is that you plead guilty, you get more convictions on your record, and guess what happens next time you're arrested? You have more convictions on your record, you're not going to get it on bail, and round and round and round it goes. So that is this cycle here. There are the principles that we have in our legal system make it tougher for you to get out in the community and more likely to be convicted of things if you have previous convictions. So that's a big impact. I'm seeing this happen because when people are first exposed to the justice system, and they're more likely to do that as a racialized person, they're more likely to be sort of drafted into this cycle. And of course, we know racialization and trauma often go hand in hand, and this creates the conditions that lead people to interactions with the law at all levels. So property crimes, violence as a result of a desperate situation, drug crimes, etc. And then once they're in prison, the statistics are so clear that they're more likely to be sentenced to custodial sentence, so that's jail time. In fact, there's a recent Senate report that you can Google if you'd like, that concluded that 50% of all serving prisoners in women's federal institutions, which is given a sentence of 2 or more years at a federal prison, are Indigenous. And I would actually say that based on what I'm seeing going into prisons, working with EFRI on the prairies out here, it's really more like 80 or 90%. It's just a sea of mostly Indigenous women who are being held in prison. So it's clear. I mean, the justice system, the people who get convicted and charged of crimes are by and far racialized people. And I want to just be really clear before I let Helen have a crack at this. Nobody should assume that this is because there is any deficiency inherent within these people. This is a result of somebody living their life as a person who society has completely othered. So that's something that I just want to make sure is communicated.
Well, I don't think it's limited to the fact that they've been othered. I think that when you consider that, you know, the retired Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada has stated that Canada had a system of cultural genocide against Indigenous people. And you look at the impacts of residential schools. So it's not just that they were othered, but in the process of being othered, the things that happened to them that have shaped their lives and, you know, shaped their upbringing as well, I think is not something that we can forget. Helen, how about you and the work that you do? How do you see the impacts of racialization?
So I've been working with Syrian, Eritrean, Ethiopian, Oromo, Sudanese, and LGBTQ plus newcomers for about the past 10 years. And they see this every day in their lives. So these are community leaders, they work for service providers, and they have to live their lives differently in terms of what they say to their children, because it isn't just within the criminal justice system, it's within the school, with health. And I remember asking, you know, youth, how many have experienced, you know, an act of racism and discrimination amongst, this was the Sudanese youth, and every single one of them put up their hand. And so with the police youth engagement program, it's our job to give the youth every opportunity to know their rights, to address racism in terms of an anti-racist practice. And there was a young man from the Somali community who's, you know, in high school, loved cars. He had, you know, not a new car, but a pretty cool looking car, and he got stopped by the police. And the police officer said, you know, can I see your license? And he said, I want to know why you've stopped me. And the police officer just asked him, and he said, you know, look, I went to the police youth engagement program, and I know that, you know, it's my right to, you know, to ask you why you are stopping me. I don't have to show you anything. You know, the police officer basically said, oh, well, yeah, oh, okay, you know. So, you know, I mean, he got stopped for being Black, and he was telling this to a deputy chief at a graduation, and the guy was just like, wow, that's what you said to him? And he said, yeah. And I mean, he was like 16 years old. I thought, great. So, you know, I think informing our youth, informing everybody about what their rights are, you know, without being antagonistic, because, you know, I think from my experience, police have a ways to go, but there are many champions, and there are racialized communities within policing. And they have, you know, to me, it's a beast of a, you know, of a system, because it has to do with, you know, enforcement. And some people are attracted to it around that, but others are attracted to it because they want to help people. They want to keep everybody safe. And so that's my take.
I just want to talk about just a recent experience that I had, and this was actually in a child welfare context. And a mother was being deprived of her children, or the government child welfare was applying to apprehend her children on the basis that she was a danger to the children and that she had been charged with assaulting them, her children. And she was Métis and clearly looked Indigenous. And I had the police officer on the stand and was questioning him, and I had his report. And what had happened was the mother had called in to the police in a 911 call saying that she was being abused or confined in her home. The police officer then, they found the residence through the cell phone, and they were able to get there. And then he found her leaving the house. It was in the middle of winter. It was -40 outside. She was wearing shorts and I think a tank top with no shoes, but she had a knife. And so he put her in the police car. He went inside, talked to the white boyfriend, who is the father of the children, was told that she had assaulted him. Then the police officer, a white police officer, then went back into the police car and immediately arrested her. He went to a 911 call from a woman alleging that she was being abused. He found her fleeing the house half naked with no shoes in the middle of winter, -40, holding a knife. I can't think of any more circumstances that sound like a woman trying to protect herself from being beaten than that. And yet she was not only charged, she was on a bail condition was for her have no contact with her children. So that caused her to have no contact for many months. And then child welfare applying to permanently take her children away. And I can only attribute that to race because it is just irrational to me. So I see this, and I've seen it on a daily basis, you know, for 30 years of my practice as a lawyer. The next question is, what sort of reform? So now we've just talked about the problems. Now we're going to try to find some solutions or make some improvements. So what sort of reforms could help make the criminal justice system more equitable? And how can we achieve systemic change to make the criminal justice system more equitable? Caitlin, do you want to take this on first?
Certainly. So I think one of the things that I want to say is that, you know, when somebody's been found guilty of a crime or when they plead guilty, there's a certain set of legal principles that judges have to take into account when they're sentencing them. And certainly this is where we talk about gladue as being a factor. We do, if somebody's Indigenous, the criminal code says that they have to consider their circumstances. But at the end of the day, there's still an emphasis on, for a lot of crime, on denunciation and deterrence as being principles that guide sentencing. Rehabilitation takes a back seat in most cases. So when we're thinking about sentencing someone for a crime, first and foremost, what the courts are doing is they're saying, how do we send a message to society that this is not acceptable? And how do we deter this person or other people in similar circumstances from committing the same crimes? In my opinion, this hasn't been effective at addressing the root causes of why people largely, and of course, the caveat is there's always going to be someone out there who led a perfectly privileged life and then ended up tangling with the law. But by and large, people arrive at committing crimes because of previous issues like intergenerational trauma, poverty, etc. Rehabilitation as a focus, in my opinion, would really cause a stopgap, and I think would really do so much to address future offending for people, if that was the focus in everyone's circumstance. And now we are seeing this, we are seeing some efforts being made. Like a couple positive things I want to talk about is in Edmonton recently, we opened an Indigenous courtroom. So specifically, there's a criminal courtroom that sits every Thursday. It's for Indigenous folks to address bail and to address sentencing principles. And the difference with this courtroom is that when you're in this program, and it's similar to mental health court, it's similar to the drug court, where it's more of a program than an actual docket courtroom, but you have access within this courtroom to workers from Yellowhead Tribal Council and Native Counseling Services who can help the accused person take steps towards that rehabilitation. We have judges that are trained in these specific GLADU factors. We have Crown prosecutors that are also very aware. So I think that's a huge step in the right direction to that culture shift. Another thing that I've seen as a shift that I think is really quite helpful is that the Edmonton Police Service has a dedicated warrant and apprehension constable who I, as a defense lawyer, can email and say, hey, I've got a client who's got warrants out. Can they arrange to speak to you, get those warrants cleared up and released without a bail hearing wherever possible? That's a relationship that we as defense lawyers can build with somebody that is really a bridge between police, where, you know, this person doesn't have to worry about being on the streets and being stopped by any random police officer. So those are some great things. But at the end of the day, what I would say is that we can make all the systemic change in the criminal justice system that we want, but it would be useless without community and societal change. So if there isn't housing for somebody to go to, that's not going to assist the most rehabilitative sentencing plan in the book. If somebody doesn't have access to treatment, then again, any other effort that we can do within the system is going to be useless. So you really, and I mean, this kind of circles back to what we talked about at the beginning. You can't really divorce the criminal justice system from society at large.
What a beautiful answer. Helen, what are your comments?
Well, similar to Caitlin, I think that, it is a huge issue, and that in terms of reforms, it's, things like collaboration, advocacy, and education. And so an example I can give is the 24/7 crisis diversion program, where, up to 5-6 years ago, if there was someone, on the streets who were homeless, maybe intoxicated or high, we didn't have something in place to support them. And so people were afraid, the public is afraid, and they would see them and say, oh my God, there's somebody who's not well, and I'm afraid of them, and I'm calling the police. And so, what can the police do? In a sense, they need help. And so 24/7 crisis diversion was a program created with police and with Boyle Street and Hope Mission and 911 and 211, which is mental health supports. And so instead of these folks being picked up by the police, they're now picked up by someone who's there to support them, attempting to help them, find housing, to find addiction supports. And so the system has been changed in terms of we're not spending police time with them, but there is something in place to support, whatever issue people have. So thousands of these calls now happen throughout the year, and it's a huge collaboration.
So in that particular example you've given, Helen, would you say that the change has come because of a change in attitude? And understanding the needs of those individuals?
Well, I think the change came for a variety of reasons. The people being picked up by the police were not really getting the supports they needed. So there was the cost of the police is not the person to help them. And how can we best help these folks? And so there are service providers that can provide those kinds of supports. It's not ideal 100%, but I think that there is some marketing, I don't know if marketing is the right word, but awareness around, there are people on the street who are homeless.
Yeah.
There's stats on how harmful are they. For the most part, they're the ones being attacked.
Yeah.
Right. So go ahead.
That's the point I was trying to make. I thought is that when I heard what you were saying, it sounded to me like it was a change in attitude towards these individuals and not seeing them as criminals, but seeing them as people in need. Mm-hmm. And then viewing our response to them, not to need to punish them, but to try to help them. Mm-hmm. And in my view, I think that is the most important change that we need in our criminal justice system, is an attitudinal change, a difference in how we understand racialized people and how we treat them, rather than the history, which was in particular with regard to Indigenous people, of trying to destroy their culture and to assimilate them, but to respect them as individuals and to understand their history and to understand their background. I really commend the Law Society right now. They have implemented a program where all lawyers must, as part of their educational program on a yearly basis, learn about the history of Indigenous people and to understand them. And that will go, I think, a long way towards how we treat people. I think if we understand them more, we will treat them more fairly. If you see more of yourself in them, I think that's going to make the system more equitable. I think that having more people in our criminal justice system who, as Helen said, so not just having more minorities themselves in the criminal justice system, but also those in the criminal justice system who may be white, but acknowledge their privileges that they've had and understand that. Having more of that, I think, in the criminal justice system will really create the change that we need. And it's good to hear from Caitlin that we're having these in law school now, that there's more of this available. We're seeing it now from the Law Society as well. So I think those are things that will really effect change. And that's part of what not-for-profit groups like the ones you're involved with, Helen, have been doing, providing education to people. And I think, Caitlin, you make a very good point as well. This is not just something that the criminal justice system can change on its own. It's going to come from societal change. And that societal change comes from education and from, not-for-profit groups and groups like this having these conversations. So the next point is, we talked from kind of the criminal justice perspective. So the next question is, how can we, the people watching, as a community, come together to support equitable change to the criminal justice system?
So
Caitlin, start again.
I'll try to keep this one a little brief because I note that we are the time here, but I think the first thing I want to say is we can all start by changing the way that we think and speak about people who have been charged and convicted with criminal offenses. I think that this eye for an eye, people need to be punished, people deserve to be harmed for what they've done, is really what stands in the way of a lot of people getting out of that system. And criminalization is marginalizing. If someone has a criminal record, it contributes to a loss of community, loss of their job, housing, more poverty. And so when we other people with convictions or charges in that way, we decontextualize the actual harm that may have occurred. So what we are now doing is inflicting further harm on somebody. So that's one thing, is to really think about, everybody is more than their mistake. Of course, accountability is something that is necessary in lots of cases, but I think that accountability can come without further punishment. So punishment and accountability are not the same thing, and that's a whole different conversation, of course. But think about how we think about people who have been charged with a criminal offense. And then the second thing I was going to say, and Helen already described 2-in-1 and the rescue van, that I think as a community, think about what circumstances really require police involvement and which can be addressed in another way. So do you need to call bylaw, or do you need to just have a conversation with your neighbor? Do you need to call the police, or is that person actually overdosing, right? It's like that's the thing I would say, is like really challenge yourself on what problems police can solve and the criminal justice system can solve, and what problems need to be solved another way.
Helen?
You know what, I'm going to go to the question that's in the box, and it's by Jadine Calverley. She says, are we limited by the political will to fund social problems that support marginalized populations? And how do we affect change in a largely conservative province? I think that's been the bane of our existence for a long time. But I always go to, people with lived experience. And what I've learned from them, well, two of them, is people go to where they feel safe and do what they feel that they can do within their own communities. So that's kind of at a little micro level. So, this young woman that's Indigenous, Black, queer, she creates change amongst her own community and in her own spaces. And I thought, wow. And then listening to an Indigenous person, these are massive issues. And what this person told me was that, when you look at things from a millennial point of view, it's like, how do you move a mountain? And so, mountains erode or change very, very slowly. And it was those kinds of, that kind of wisdom that I thought, okay, all right, stay the course and be with people that you can trust and feel safe with, without getting, too caught up, but to move slowly and with intention and action.
I see we're almost out of time, so I didn't moderate our time that well, but I'm going to say one thing. I didn't make these questions. These were provided for us, but I see the beauty of these questions, because my response to this last thing is to go back to the first question, and that's the importance about talking about it. All of the issues we've talked about we need them to be out in the open so that we can deal with them. And so I think that as a community, what we need to do to have this equitable change is to continue to talk about it and to hold people accountable where there is, discrimination. The Law Society is coming out and admitting it. So there are ways that within our system to hold people accountable when they, might require some education, or we might require, more than education, some discipline. And there are ways in our society that we can make complaints against police. There are ways that we can make complaints against lawyers and judges and whatnot. So if we see discrimination, we don't need to sit on our hands. We can talk about it, we can point it out, and we can ask for change. So I think that talking about it, just as we're doing here right now, is so important.
Absolutely, thank you. And we want to thank all of our viewers for attending this evening. We'd like to thank our wonderful moderator, Mr. Robert Lee, and our two speakers, Ms. Caitlin Dick, Ms. Helen Rusich. We want to thank you so much for sharing your experience, your time, your wisdom with us. And we hope to see you all back again next month for our session on June 22nd, same time, 5 to 6 p.m. on climate change. Thank you.